Croeso I Gastell Nedd. Welcome to Neath, a historic market town in the heart of South Wales. Situated just a short distance from the town of Talbot to the southeast and the city of Swansea to the southwest, Neath is a bustling market town filled to the brim with interesting sights. And on this brief walk around the historic town centre, we'll visit Neath's majestic market hall, pass by the historic Castle Hotel, famously the birthplace of the Welsh Rugby Union, and we'll of course admire the remains of Neath Castle, a medieval-era fortress which overlooks the River Neath. All of that is to come over the next 15 minutes or so, as we make our way around Neath on this sunny afternoon. But we begin our walk in the town's splendid Victoria Gardens, a beautiful open space which is always full of life, as locals relax among a collection of fetching historic landmarks. The garden's centrepiece is this ornate octagonal bandstand. It was built more than 120 years ago in 1897, when the gardens were first laid out and opened in celebration of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Although built towards the end of her reign, Neath's Victoria Gardens have often been described as the quintessential Victorian town park, complete with colourful flower beds, a wide array of lush trees and pristinely mowed lawns, and a few more statues and monuments dotted about. But before the beautiful gardens that we know today, this part of Neath was still a popular gathering place for locals. Previously, this place was known as the Corporation Field, regularly used for local sports matches and the town's annual fair, held in September. Neath's Great September Fair, one of the oldest in Britain, still runs today, although it's grown far too large and hectic for these tranquil gardens, which were actually the brainchild of a local builder named Thomas Snow. Now initially Snow's gardens weren't quite as dense with features as they are today. For instance, this statue, depicting the local 19th century politician Hywel Gwyn, was only moved into the gardens in 1967. Previously, it stood outside the Gwyn Hall, a historic town theatre which we'll find just a few steps away. But before we get there, we certainly can't ignore the beautiful St David's Church, which stands tall above the town of Neath. It was built back in the 1860s on a grand scale, complete with a majestic Gothic tower and a beautiful array of stained glass windows inside, well worth taking a look at if you're in town. In more recent years, St David's Church is also well known for its association with the famed Welsh singer, Catherine Jenkins. She grew up here in Neath and was a girl chorister at the church. She's one of a number of famous faces to find their roots in this town of around 50,000 people today, while others, such as the First World War soldier Alan Leonard Lewis, who lends his name to this local pub and was awarded a Victoria Cross for his bravery during the war, were born elsewhere, but later found Neath as their home. With a diverse community of locals through the decades, the town of Neath has changed greatly over time. In fact, just here we're passing by the Gwyn Hall, which, as we mentioned, is a historic Victorian-era theatre, built back in 1887 on land given to the town by the local politician, Hywel Gwyn. But as we can see, the theatre's historic facade is rather different to how it began. The building was nearly destroyed by a fire in 2007, and so the modern glass front has been added as part of a recent restoration project. The Gwyn Hall is one of the main landmarks on this, Orchard Street, which comes to an end just here, where it meets New Street as well as Church Place, where you'll find the local parish church of St Thomas just to the right behind the buildings, and Green Street, traditionally one of the main venues for Neath's historic town markets. As we know, Neath is a market town with centuries of history. A makeshift market was held in what was then a village as early as the 12th century, while the Great September Fair was first held in the 13th century. Because of this, people have travelled from far and wide to buy and sell goods here in Neath for centuries. And just here we find the central feature of the town's markets, the historic indoor market hall, which was built back in 1837 to host stalls in the town's ever-growing industrial-era marketplace. The market hall is big, with space for 40 traders, selling everything from fresh produce to locally farmed meat and an array of boutique crafts. But once upon a time, this was just one part of what was one of South Wales' fastest growing towns. While Neath has indeed been a place of commerce since the Middle Ages, this town's fortunes skyrocketed upon the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. Once surrounded by agricultural land, Neath was transformed into a centre of heavy industry, where factories produced steel, iron, tin and more, while coal was mined widely across the valleys further inland. Much of the town as we see it today, therefore, is a product of wealth brought in by local industry. Many of the majestic buildings on Windsor Road here were built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Neath's industrial output was at its peak. The success of industry here attracted thousands of people to move to the town in the first half of the 19th century. Neath's population grew nearly 10 times in size throughout the period. And to keep the ever-growing populace in order, in 1836 the town appointed its very first policeman, a man named David Prothero, who's now remembered at this pub, housed inside a former police station which was built back in 1937. It stands straight across the road from Neath railway station, which sits on the South Wales Main Line, providing a direct link to the cities of Swansea, Cardiff and even London, more than 200 miles away. But the town's modern station is just one of what were once 4 railway stops to be found in Neath. Historically, the station we know today was known as Neath General, while elsewhere around town you would have found Neath Canalside, which stood on the line linking the industrial valley of Rhondda with Swansea Docks. There was also Neath Bridge Street, which stood at one end of the old Neath and Brecon Railway, and Neath Abbey Station to the west of the town centre, on a former line running to Aberdare and Merthyr Tydfil. By modern standards, it may seem unusual for a town of this size to have had 4 stations. But of course, back during the golden age of Britain's railways, Neath was an important focal point within the thriving industrial sphere of South Wales. Along with the railways, canals were built linking this town with Swansea Docks, as well as industrial sites further inland, while the River Neath, from which the town takes its name, was for a long time used by boats to transport goods from the sea, Neath having existed as an inland river port for much of its history. Now we know that the river is the source for this town's English name, but in Welsh, Neath is known as Castell Neath, which literally means Castle Neath. Literally, Neath means something like sparkling river, while Castell, of course, refers to Neath Castle, the historic medieval fortress which we'll find just a few steps away from here. But of course there are plenty more references to Neath Castle all over town, and just here we see the Castle Hotel, perhaps the most famous inn in town. Once known as the Ship and Castle Hotel, this 18th century inn began life as a popular stop on the road between Swansea and Merthyr Tydfil. But over time its reputation has grown, having on occasion hosted famous guests, including Vice Admiral Nelson and Hollywood stars Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. But the hotel is best known as the so-called home of Welsh Rugby Union, for it was here in 1881 that 11 rugby clubs from across Wales met to discuss forming a union, and they unanimously decided to form what we still know today as the Welsh Rugby Union. The 11 clubs that met here came from far and wide, including representatives from Bangor, Newport, Llanelli, Lampeter, Cardiff, Swansea and more, but strangely not Neath. As we pass by the town hall, which was built more than 200 years ago, in 1821, the town of Neath is actually home to the oldest rugby club in all of Wales, founded over 150 years ago in 1871. Perhaps it was because of this significance that 11 other clubs decided to meet here in Neath, but no explanation has ever been given for the fact that Neath RFC didn't make the meeting. They might not have been invited, or somebody may have just forgotten to put down their name, given that the town was hosting the meet. Maybe we'll never know, but you'll have noticed that we've just passed by the Castell Neath Arms, which stands just a stone's throw away from the oldest building in the town centre, the historic Neath Castle. From here, we'll take a look around the remains of the castle, which can trace its origins back to the early 12th century, although that was far from the beginning of this town. People have been living in Neath for thousands of years, the town located around the site of a ford, a crossable point of the River Neath. Now, the ford gave this place great strategic significance, and as such the area around it was widely settled by native Britons and later the Romans, who established a small fort called Needham beside the river in the year AD 74. But the ruins of the medieval castle, just behind the small roundhouse here, came more than 1,000 years after the Romans, and it was during this intervening period that the foundations for the modern town of Neath were laid. The Romans didn't stay at Needham for long. In fact, it was abandoned after less than 100 years in AD 170, and the region was returned to the native Britons, in the border regions between a pair of early medieval Welsh kingdoms. Over time, greater settlement developed on the banks of the River Neath, although more so to the north of the modern town centre, in the area now known as Llantwit. But in the 12th century, as the Normans began to sweep across South Wales, this part of the river became the centre of a major new settlement. Initially, a castle was constructed on the site of the old Roman fort of Needham, but that was on the other side of the river, and it was soon abandoned in favour of one here, on the river's eastern bank. The new castle was originally built of wood, and was eventually destroyed after repeated attacks by native Welsh armies in the early 13th century. To replace it, a stronger stone castle was built, although the Welsh quickly dispatched of that one too, as well as much of the Norman-era town which had developed on the outskirts of the fortress. The castle that stands today then dates mostly from the late 13th century, when it was rebuilt under the reign of the English King Edward I, and the fortress remained in use as a grand residence for the Norman lords of Neath for a few centuries, although successive armed clashes gradually led it to fall into disrepair, and the state in which we see it today. But the castle remains, now protected, are a striking reminder of this town's lengthy history. And after just a brief tour of the town centre, I hope you've got a good idea of the sights and stories that make up modern-day Neath. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Neath for yourself sometime soon.